All right, so you want to understand what's going on between Iran and Israel, right? We're talking breaking news and an in-depth analysis to help unpack this powder keg of a situation. It's complex with global implications, so we're really going to dive deep on the latest developments.
It's important to understand this isn't just a sudden flare-up. This situation has been simmering for decades, so the historical context is really crucial here.
Yeah, and things are definitely escalating quickly, right? I mean, right off the bat, we're seeing Iran basically putting its Gulf neighbors in a tough spot. They're saying any support for Israel, even letting them use their airspace, would be considered a hostile act. So, what's the strategy behind this kind of aggressive stance?
Well, it's more than just a message to the Gulf states. This is classic Iran.
Right.
They're playing chess, always have been, trying to isolate their rivals strategically and diplomatically. Think back to the tanker wars in the 80s, similar tactics. Now, for these Gulf states, it's tricky. It's a tightrope walk because they're trying to balance those long-standing security ties with the U.S., but at the same time, they're trying to, improve relations with Iran. And it's interesting to see Tehran directly link regional stability with pushing back against Israel. It's a bold move.
It is a real high-stakes balancing act, for sure. And speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about these mixed messages coming out of Iran itself. On the one hand, you've got President Pezeshkian saying, we don't want war, but also stating they'll respond forcefully to any attack. And then you've got figures like Ibrahim Aziz who are, well, they're issuing some pretty direct threats against Israel. It's giving off a kind of peace through strength vibe, but is it working?
See, this is where understanding Iran's internal power dynamics becomes absolutely key. President Pezeshkian, he's always been more of a pragmatist, trying to keep a diplomatic track open even when things are tense. But you've got hardliners, like Aziz, representing a much more militant faction within the government. So to predict Iran's next move, you really have to understand which of these factions has the upper hand at any given time.
It's like trying to decode a message in the middle of a cyber attack. You're never quite sure who's really in control. And meanwhile, over in Israel, we're seeing what seems like a very calculated response. Netanyahu just delayed his own defense minister's trip to the U.S. They were supposed to be discussing strategy, right? So what kind of signal does that send?
It tells me that Israel understands they're on a global stage, and they're playing their cards carefully, delaying that trip. They could be trying to do a few things. First, it buys them time to assess, really figure out the situation, coordinate more closely with the U.S. on a response. Second, it keeps Iran guessing, which, in a situation like this, can be an advantage. And third, it might be a subtle signal to Tehran. Hey, we're open to de-escalation, but only under certain conditions. It's a classic case of strategic ambiguity, where keeping your options open can be a very powerful tool.
Strategic ambiguity. Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, can you break it down? What does that look like in action?
Sure, think of it like a high-stakes poker game. You don't want to show your opponent your full hand, right?
Yeah.
Keep them guessing. In this case, Israel wants Iran to know that a strong retaliation is on the table, but they also want to leave some room for diplomacy. And sometimes that uncertainty, it can prevent the other side from making a rash move.
So it's a high-stakes poker game, and nobody wants to tip their hand too early. But at the same time, Israel's defense minister has publicly promised a deadly, precise, and surprising retaliation. So they're definitely not backing down. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. It's strategic ambiguity in action. They want to project strength, deter Iran from further action, but without necessarily escalating things themselves. It's a tough line to walk.
It really is, especially when you consider the potential targets here. I mean, we're seeing reports that everything's on the table, right? Iranian military bases, oil facilities, even their nuclear program. It's a terrifying thought, and each option carries enormous risks.
Right. And this is where that concept of escalation dominance comes into play. It's basically who can escalate the conflict in a way that the other side simply cannot match. Each side feels like they have to respond more forcefully than the last, and, well, you can see how that can quickly spiral. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Right.
Textbook example of escalation dominance almost leading to catastrophe. And the fact that Iran is even mentioning Gulf oil facilities, I mean, that could impact the entire global economy. It shows you how quickly this could get out of hand.
It's like everyone's playing chicken, but with the whole world in the passenger seat.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you can't forget about, well, the elephant in the room, Iran's nuclear ambitions. Could this conflict actually push them closer to developing a weapon?
It's a real concern, absolutely.
Yeah.
Put yourself in Iran's shoes for a second. You're constantly feeling threatened by, powerful nations with advanced militaries. A nuclear deterrent might start to look like, well, the only way to guarantee your own security, even with all the risks and consequences that come with it. We've seen them make progress on their nuclear program before, even with sanctions in place. This conflict could just strengthen their resolve, especially if they feel like Israel or the U.S. won't tolerate even the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran.
So you've got these regional rivalries, internal power struggles, military posturing, and this looming fear of nuclear escalation. It's a lot, and the stakes are incredibly high. What's really striking me is the potential for miscalculation here. It seems like one wrong move, one misunderstanding could set off a chain of events that nobody can control.
You're absolutely right to focus on that. This is a region with a long history of conflict, right? We're talking about deep mistrust, simmering resentment, a lot of baggage between these countries. Add in the stakes, national security, religious tensions, access to vital resources, and yeah, the potential for things to boil over is huge. Both sides have shown they're willing to use force, and the rhetoric is only getting more inflammatory. In that kind of environment, even a small incident, a miscommunication, could be misinterpreted. And suddenly you have this, well, this rapid and devastating escalation on your hands.
And it's not just about Iran and Israel either, right? This could easily draw in other major players in the region, even pull the U.S. in deeper than they want to be. We know the Biden administration is urging restraint, but how much influence do they realistically have at this point? What about the other Gulf states? They're caught in the middle, trying to stay on good terms with everyone.
You've hit on a crucial point. This isn't some isolated conflict, right?
Yeah.
This is happening within this incredibly complex web of alliances, rivalries, historical baggage. The U.S. is trying to walk this tightrope, support Israel's security without sparking a wider war. But their leverage is limited, especially with U.S.-Iran relations already incredibly strained. As for the other Gulf states, man, they are in a tough spot. They don't want to get dragged into a war, but they also can't alienate either side. They're trying to maintain this delicate balance. But as the situation escalates, that becomes harder and harder to do.
It's like watching a car race towards a cliff in slow motion and everyone's still arguing about who's going to hit the brakes.
Yeah.
It's hard to see a clear path to de-escalation, especially with the level of distrust that we're seeing.
Absolutely, and we can't ignore the fact that this is all happening against the backdrop of, a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and southern Lebanon. We're talking about countless innocent lives caught in the crossfire, displaced families, a sense of desperation that's only deepening with the violence. It adds another layer of urgency and complexity to this whole situation.
It's heartbreaking, honestly. And to be honest, it feels like the international community is almost paralyzed, unable to break this cycle of violence. Everyone's quick to issue condemnations and call for restraint, but nobody seems to have any real answers. At this point, is there even hope for a negotiated solution? Or are we just careening towards another major conflict in the Middle East?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, yeah, it's hard to be optimistic when you look at everything that's going on, the level of mistrust, the seriousness of the threats, the potential consequences if someone makes a wrong move. It's a lot. But I do think, even with all of that, we have to hold on to the idea that diplomacy can still play a role. It really is the only way out of this cycle of violence, the only way to prevent even more suffering.
You're right. I mean, the alternative is it's almost unthinkable. But with so much distrust already, how can anyone even get to the negotiating table, let alone actually find common ground?
Well, it's a huge challenge, no question. But history has shown us time and again that even when you've got these really entrenched adversaries, they can find ways to at least start talking, even if it's behind the scenes, Quiet diplomacy. Sometimes just having that dialogue, even if it's tense, even if it's difficult, it can start to build a little bit of trust or at least create a space for understanding the other side's perspective. The key is that all the players involved have to be willing to consider that compromise might be possible.
So as tense as things are right now, it's not a given that this will explode into a full-blown war. There's still a chance, even a small one, that diplomacy could be the way out.
Exactly. And it's a chance worth fighting for. It means being willing to have those tough conversations, demand accountability from all sides, and maybe most importantly, just refuse to give up on the possibility of a future where peace is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible.
It's a message we could all use a little more of right now, I think. We've spent this deep dive really digging into this immediate crisis, the breaking news, the very real potential for things to spiral out of control. But you've brought up a really crucial point. This conflict, it has deep roots. This goes back generations. We're talking about a tangled web of grievances, betrayals, shifting alliances. So as we wrap up today, we want to leave you with this. Yeah. How might understanding that deeper context, that long, complex history, change how we view potential solutions? It's something to think about as we all try to navigate this incredibly volatile situation.
Please subscribe and like our content to support us.